We can go ahead now. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the IDRN Networks webinar. I think we've been, going for over a year now, and just so you know, my name is Nora. I'm involved in the board of the IDRN, Irish Deaf Research Network. But to explain more about what the IDRN is, I'm going to hand over to our chairperson, John Bosco, and he'll be able to explain a little bit more. So can everybody see me? I don't need to be spotlighted. I wonder if I'm okay. So I've just recently become the chairperson for the IDRN, the Irish Deaf Research Network, and that was established before COVID, pre-COVID, pre-2017. And I think there are about 4 or 5 different universities involved. We tried to share ideas, information, awareness among ourselves. And the aim of this organization is to promote, increase Irish research for national and international areas, both national and international. And the universities, many more universities have joined in, and we've grown since we've been established. The research obviously has to follow a high quality of ethics, has to be high quality, must follow ethical standards, covers linguistics, social research, culture, research around culture, a lot of other things, deaf studies, education, deaf history, and the list goes on. But the aim of the Irish Deaf Research Network is for our deaf communities and those who sign, if anything that might impact their lives. We welcome anybody who has a strong research or a strong interest in research, or whether they're involved in university or not, they're very welcome to join the IDR. And I think at the moment we have roughly 50 members, and we would obviously like to grow that. And like Nora was saying recently, we're coming back to being active. But enjoy the webinar this evening. So just waiting for Cormac to possibly spotlight me. Great. So before I introduce Caroline, I wanted to explain a little bit about the technical details for this evening. Whether you're using your phone or your iPad, quite often you will be able to see the PowerPoint primarily on your screen, and that can be an issue. So if you have any difficulties where you can't see the presenter, it might be easier to move to a laptop. But if everybody seems to be having no technical difficulties and everybody is okay, and there's one person who's having difficulties, unfortunately won't be able to offer tech support, you're going to have to try and sort it out yourself. But obviously, if everybody is experiencing the same difficulties, we will do our best to sort it. Caroline's presentation is going to be roughly 45 to 50 minutes. I'm sure you might see some things that come up that you'd like to ask some questions, and you don't want to hold it to the end in case you forget. But if you look on the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A section. You can click onto that and type in your question for the presenter, so she'll be able to see it at the end. So next part of our introductions. This is a very exciting presentation. Caroline McGrotty is our presenter this evening. Caroline has a BA in Deaf Studies, in Quality Studies and ISL Teaching. She's very recently passed her Masters by Research in DCU. Well done, Caroline. And so her what she's recently passed, she's going to present that research this evening from her Masters in Research. Caroline has over 17 years of experience working in the disability area. She's been strongly, majorly involved in the deaf community on both the boards of various organisations, IDYA, the Irish Deaf Youth Association, among others. I'm trying to remember everything now. Deaf Village Ireland, the Sign Language Interpreting Service, and the list goes on. She has a wealth of experience, so it's a real honour to have Caroline come and present for us this evening. So I really look forward to this, and if there are any questions, don't forget, pop them in the Q&A section, and then if we have time at the end, we'll give you the opportunity to maybe to be able to sign that. If you'd rather type it, that's fine. And if you want to sign your question, then you can let us know, and we'll pass it on to Caroline. I think it's time for me to turn my camera off. You don't need to see my face anymore. Okay, Caroline. Okay. I'm trying to see now. You can see me? Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm looking at the numbers now, and there's, I think, about 60 people watching this evening. And myself and Cormac have been texting back and forth around how many people have been registering. There was 130 people registered the last I checked, and there's over 70 people here now. So, of a Tuesday evening after your dinner. So, thank you very much for coming and watching my presentation. I really appreciate that. Like Nora mentioned, I've just recently passed. It hasn't even been 2 weeks. So since I passed my master's by research with no corrections, I might add. So I'm delighted with that. This is the first ever full in-depth presentation I'll be giving to the public about my research. So it's perfect timing to do it at the moment. So my research topic is my best friend was the interpreter. And that's a direct quote from one of the deaf students who said that as part of my research. But really, I was studying deaf students, interpreters, and lecturers in university setting, in higher education setting, or universities, colleges. So I've been doing part-time research for the last 3 years, and it's been funded by the Higher Education Authority, the HEA. So today, really, I have various topics that I'm going to speak about. Just to give you a little bit of background, I can explain my research and who was involved. But the important thing is, sorry, changing my view. Sorry, Caroline, yeah. Good, all good. Can everybody see me okay? Interpreters, yep, yes. Perfect. So this evening I'm going to talk about 4 different topics. So Nora's already given a little bit about my background. I won't repeat it again, but my background is in research and education work. But at the same time, a lot of people probably don't know about my wealth of experience that I have. I think it's important to mention about my own lived experience as a deaf person. I'm a deaf coda. My parents were deaf. So I'm a third generation deaf person in my family, and I think it's very important to mention that. And myself as a bilingual and bimodal user, which means I use both speech and sign. I can do both. It just depends on the situation, and that's a major part of my identity. As part of my education, I've had various different experiences. I started in mainstream school, and then I moved to a deaf school. And then I went to university by myself as a deaf student with hearing and deaf students mixed. And then I've been in a university where I'm the only deaf person. So my experiences vary, and all of my experiences put together create my identity. And of course, I'm using interpreters this evening. Interpreters are voicing over for me. So I have, a lot of various different life experiences, whether it's my work, whether it's personal, whether it's volunteering within the deaf community, and focusing on my studies with my deaf studies and that. And so this is why I'm so interested in this topic. Before I go on, I just wanted to mention, I know that language can be quite sensitive, and I know there are a lot of people talk about, big D deaf, small D deaf. But just to explain, as part of my research, I'm using deaf and hard of hearing. Deaf and hard of hearing for me means any deaf person, it doesn't matter their level of deafness, whether they prefer sign or speech, but just a deaf or hard of hearing person, just themselves. And I'm going to use the terms deaf students, and it is small d deaf, but it's those students who sign, just to be clear. If you see me mention DHH or deaf, hard of hearing, whether they speak or sign, it's all in one. And the students that I'm focusing on are students who sign. And when I speak out about interpreters, we have deaf interpreters, hearing interpreters, but my research is focused on interpreters who go between spoken and signed languages, so which is ISL to English interpreters, not deaf interpreters. Just to be clear, from the start, that that's my research focuses on those hearing interpreters who go from ISL to English and back and forth. So I had three questions really for my research aims. I wanted to understand, whether it was a deaf student or an interpreter or the lecturer. How was their relationship with each other? How did they get on? I wanted to understand more in depth about that. My second question was, if me as a lecturer, if I had one deaf student within my class, if I had perhaps two, three, four, or 10 deaf students in my class with hearing students mixed, and I was teaching both, what is the difference? Is there a difference or is it the same? The third question I wanted to know between these three different groups, you know, it's just important for them to know that they are involved in making sure that deaf students can take part in university. And I wanted to see their views on, strategies and supports to ensure that inclusion. And just to give you a little bit of a background. So for the last 20 years, universities or higher education, HE means higher education. So really universities or colleges. There's been a big change, with national policy, and there's a lot more encouragement of diversity and disabilities, inclusion, whether it's the traveling community, people with disabilities, and they're encouraging more and more people to attend third level education. And so, teaching styles and everything like that have changed a lot over the last 20 years. And in the last 10 years, the number of students with disabilities has grown so much. It's grown every year, of just students with disabilities entering third level education. But among deaf students, it's not really changing. So it doesn't really match with society, the number of deaf students attending third level education. So of course, if I was a lecturer and I'm lecturing these students, my relationship with the students, traditionally has been that an interpreter would come in as a third party or a third person. And so we want to talk about that relationship between the lecturer and, whether there's the interpreter and the deaf student. And there's not much research about that.
So that's the background that some of you may already know, some of you may not. So when we're talking about the higher education sector, if we look at the situation 20 years ago, there was a national access plan printed by the HEA in 2004. And the reason for its publication was to encourage people with disabilities, people from disadvantaged areas, etc., to enter third level education. And that has continued to this day. And that encouragement remains present. So that has led to big changes in the sector. Also, the Department of Education announced a strategic plan that was to run for 20 years for universities, and also various systems of support. For example, the DARE system, DARE, for people who had finished their leaving certificate exams and who wanted to go into university, but this system offered reduced points because of their disability. So students were encouraged to apply for that. Funding was obtained for students with disabilities to provide sign language interpreters, captioners, note takers, and other forms of support. So the funding has been available for those supports. And also universities have to have a disability support service, or DSS, who are responsible for administration of those supports, one-to-one meetings with the students with disabilities, and they form a coordinator role in that relationship. There's also more knowledge and awareness of universal design principles, UDL, universal design for learning, knowledge of how to change teaching styles to suit a variety of different kinds of students. Far more awareness of that at the moment. So that's higher education. So moving to the sector of sign language interpreting. Interpreters began to be trained back in 2001, 2002. There hadn't been any proper system in place to train interpreters before that, but then the Centre for Deaf Studies was established. That happened in 2001, and that offered a training program for interpreters at last at third level. And most disability support services now offer interpreters who've been through that course. We also have the Irish Sign Language Act passed in 2017, and that has meant that public bodies have to use interpreters that are members of a register, which is called RISLI, RISLI. And RISLI was established as part of the Act, and this means that in higher education, only registered interpreters are permitted to be used. So that is the current situation around that. And there's been lots of different research as well that indicates that there is about 173 interpreters have qualified since that training opened, but less than that are on the RISLI register. Last July, according to the manager of RISLI, there was only something like 99 registered, which means that there is a shortage of interpreters to meet the needs of deaf students in education and other areas. So this, it also has an effect that I want to examine. So that's a little bit of context for you. Sign language interpreting services back in 2017 announced a need for a lot more interpreters, a national shortage of those personnel, but still we are dealing with this issue of an insufficient number of interpreters. In Ireland and other countries, I suppose in Ireland less than other countries, you would have some interpreters in primary schools elsewhere. You don't really see that in Ireland. What you really see is sign language interpreters being provided for third level education, as opposed to primary and secondary. You'll see very rare provision of interpreters for deaf kids under, let's say, before third level education stage. So this might look a little bit confusing, this graph, but just bear with me, I'll explain it. It's research from AHEAD, who published a report about the numbers of people with disabilities in education each year. So this information has been gathered since 1992. And you can see the dark blue upward direction line there crossing the red downward direction. So the dark blue indicates the number of individual students since 1992. It was 69 in 1992, a very small number of students with disabilities. And it was recently announced in a report that there's 555, so over 500 students with disabilities. Now, that said, we need to look at this downward facing curve, because even though more students with disabilities are entering university, the amount of deaf students is declining. It isn't increasing at the same rate as that of students with other disabilities. So yes, we're seeing students go into universities, but we also need to think about other disabilities and why are those numbers not keeping pace? So the research doesn't mention how many deaf students currently use ISL. It uses phrases like deaf and hard of hearing, and they could use a range of different supports, including captioning. So we haven't had accurate figures to date around this. But I've certainly spoken to the HEA about this and asked if they have these figures. Now, they don't have that information currently. So when I applied for funding to colleges, they announced that, when the HEA, apologies, I asked the HEA if they had information about the number of deaf students in university, and they said that they weren't able to supply that information to me because they just didn't have it. They didn't have that level of detail. So it occurred to me that funding for students with disabilities, universities had to declare numbers to get that funding, because they also then had to declare the amount that they were spending on interpreters. So would they be able to tell me as a result of that how many universities applied for interpreters? And they were able to supply this information to me. So if you look at this graph here, over the last 5 years, if you look at the six universities here, in terms of funding for interpreters, 6 universities means 6 students, or maybe one university might have more than one student. The information isn't perfect, but it's in relation to the amount of figures of ISL using deaf students, it's really, really hard to get this information. Okay, so to talk about my literature review, this is looking at the background of the Irish situation in this regard and comparing it to other countries as well. Now, it's a little bit limited in terms of Irish research. I think internationally, there's a lot more out there to go through, but there's 3 areas where there's significant gaps. The research talks about the student-interpreter relationship, but it doesn't necessarily talk much about the relationship between deaf student and the lecturer. There's very little about that in the literature. And there's also very little about the triadic relationship between interpreter, lecturer, and deaf student, almost nothing at all. And then about teaching styles and teaching deaf groups, research about that topic is particularly rare. So there was a systematized review process with 39 studies included in this review that I used for my research. And that was the research that feeds into my findings. So from the literature review, as I say, most of the literature I looked at was international, looking at deaf students going into university, not knowing what kind of supports were there. That's a common theme. There's also common themes of isolation and how that affects the student's educational journey. Deaf students had to self-advocate quite a lot when they were in university for the supports they needed. There was some areas there in relation to interpreter skills that were lacking. In particular, subject-specific vocabulary, technical words and jargon that didn't have standardized sign or proved difficult for translation. Those issues came up a lot in my literature review. And then there was deaf people experiencing difficulty with accessing education through an interpreter and visual tiredness. Staff didn't have enough awareness about interpreters and about dealing with deaf people. And there was a lot of confusion about the role of the sign language interpreter among staff. So these are the points from the 39 reviews, the review of the 39 studies that I carried out. So now I just want to talk a little bit about how I conducted my research and who the research was with. Altogether, there was 21 participants in my research, 7 deaf students, 8 interpreters, and 6 lecturing staff. I conducted one-to-one interviews with each, and the interviews were all through their preferred language. So, for example, some of the deaf students preferred me to speak and sign at the same time, which I accommodated. Some of them preferred to just use ISL. And then for the interpreters, most of them preferred to do spoken language interviews, which I suppose sometimes they would use ISL when they wanted to explain certain situations. There was, in practice, a mixture of ISL and English. And then I generally use spoken English with lecturing staff. So I accommodated their communication needs in that respect. So the interview data was gathered, and I would have done a reflexive thematic analysis used by Braun and Clark. And they have, I suppose, 6 phases in terms of their research. And that I went through those phases with the information that I gathered through the interviews. And the NVivo software package was used then to analyze this data. Now, I preferred sometimes to do this by hand in a more visual way that was intuitive to me. So I think I used both software-based approaches and a manual approach when necessary. So for deaf students who I interviewed, as I say, that there was a variety of different kind of experiences that they had. Some had just recently graduated. Some had been out of school for a long time. They were doing a variety of different disciplines: business, education, engineering. And a lot of the students, after their initial, let's say, bachelor's degree, continued to study after that. All 7 of the students, it was really interesting, had never used an interpreter in the educational sphere before university. This was their first experience with the sign language interpreter for many of them. They'd never used an interpreter in school, and university was their first contact with this service. 6 of them had experience of being a single student, as in the only deaf student in the class. And often they felt that they were the only deaf student in the entire university. They didn't see any other deaf people around them. So that's the information that they had anyway, that they thought that they were the only one around in their university. And 3 of the students then had experience of co-enrolled settings, which means that they were in a group of their peers with other deaf students in their class. There might be 4 students, for example, in a class of hearing students, or 10 other hearing students alongside that group of 4, for example. So 3 of the cohort that I interviewed experienced that, whereas 6 had experienced being the only deaf student in their group. Okay, so now to the interpreters. 8 of those, 6 of them had said that they hadn't really got any formal training during their time studying to become an interpreter. They weren't given specific training about how to handle educational interpreting issues. The 8 of them did say that within a year of graduating, they were working in higher education. So basically within a year, almost immediately after qualifying as interpreters, all of them had experience of interpreting for a single deaf student on their own. And then 6 of them had experience of interpreting for, as I say, these co-enrolled groups and more than one deaf student in the class. You can see the pie chart here has a visual representation of that. So as I say, some of them, had various levels of experience, like up to 15 years, and then others had less than 4 years of experience. Okay, moving on now to the lecturers that I interviewed. And 3 of the 6, it was quite interesting because 3 of these had formal teaching qualifications, but then the others didn't. They didn't have a formal teaching qualification as such. 4 of them then had experience of teaching one deaf student in their class, and another 3 had experience of teaching, as I say, a co-enrolled group. So the 2 different pictures here, the first pie chart there shows that most didn't have most of them did have a good amount of experience, and then the other shows that you can see the columns there, and it shows the different kinds of experience that staff had, and they were asked, did they have formal training in 3 different areas supporting students with disabilities? And about half them said that they had formal training in that. Then there was a question whether they had formal training in supporting deaf students. Just one of the lecturers said that they had that. And then they were asked, had they worked with interpreters? Or formal training in work with interpreters? None of them had. So dark blue indicates informal, what they'd read themselves maybe, or picked up in chats with colleagues. But in terms of formal training, that was quite rare across those 3 questions.
So now the exciting part. So there were 5 different themes, and it was really, really hard for me to summarize this and make it smaller, just to make sure I had enough of this rich, valuable information that I had gathered shared. So the themes I focused on included student inclusion, and really, students obviously like to have flexibility around their supports. So, for example, all the deaf students did use interpreters, but at the same time, they wanted to be able to use different supports, whether that was captioning, because maybe they might have had like a heavy, a mathematical or numerical class, and they want to be able to use that. Or if they were gone off on placement, they didn't want to have an interpreter with them. They preferred to be able to just see what the real world looked like. So they wanted to have more flexibility and variety around what kind of supports matched their needs. The students who were on their own, they often talked about how they felt lonely, how they felt isolated and disheartened, and how they felt different. And those who weren't the only deaf students who might have been co-enrolled and were with other deaf students, they said they felt, a strong sense of belonging and been able to support each other. But it was interesting, the interpreters said that the interpreters were used, and it was really important for social inclusion. So whether it was morning, the interpreter might interpret, they might be interpreting all day and they'll need a break. But if they saw the deaf student sitting on their own, they would often go and sit with them to interpret through break time so that they could, foster that kind of social inclusion. They might have given up their break time or their lunch time, thinking that the deaf student would need more support, being able to engage with their peers. But, between most of all the lecturers, the students, and the interpreters, they said things have gotten better, in past years. If as the years have gone by, there is more awareness, but there are still issues such as funding for interpreters, and that's a massive barrier because the funding for interpreters doesn't cover social interpreting or evening events or a variety of events that might be on within the college. So it can vary depending on university. They're not all the same. It depends on each university's policies. So there might be some of them have had negative and positive experiences. It depends on each individual and the university they attend. One individual mentioned that at the time there was one module they had that there was no interpreter available for, and so the Disability Support Service just said, sorry, there's nothing we can do. And so they were left with no interpreter for one specific module. And another deaf student mentioned that when they didn't have an interpreter, they decided to try and change to captioning or some other support. They could use a different mode. And so it depended on the attitude of the university. It wasn't all the same. Some others, weren't as willing. So these are some quotes from some of the students. This is Sean, who was a single deaf student, and they're referring to their feeling different at their experience in university. They experienced a lot of anxiety going into university in the morning because they were the only deaf student and everybody was looking at them, and they were arriving into university with an interpreter, and that created some anxiety for them. This is a quote from an interpreter, Iris. She said, you're trying to, there might have a deaf person who's really young, they're trying to meet friends, you're trying to facilitate that and help them, but they might not communicate with other students, which means that if you're the only interpreter and you're working on your own, that you're absolutely exhausted because you're interpreting all day and then interpreting at break time, and so it can be really exhausting. So Lorraine is a lecturer, and she said that, she's worked with there's one deaf student in her class, and she never knew she never knew there was going to be a deaf student until an interpreter arrived on the first day. And she felt that it would be better if there was more planning and preparation prior to this. And she said the Disability Support Service never told her that she was going to have a deaf student in her class. And so she didn't know, and so felt a bit awkward at the start. And she would have liked to have known beforehand to be able to prepare. So in terms of relational dynamics, uh, deaf students often mention that they felt an added responsibility or added layer compared to the hearing students, because they would have to discuss with the interpreter, send them the notes in advance, and make sure all that was okay. Whereas the hearing students didn't have those extra responsibilities or extra work that they had to do as part of their university life. And the interpreter said the same thing as well. They felt that the deaf students had a lot of extra responsibility compared to the hearing students. They said the interpreter, was there to communicate and to interpret the classes, but a lot of the time the interpreter would end up taking on an advocacy role, having to tell the deaf student, various things about how to get places or what to do, or tell them where to go, or give them extra information, or guide the deaf student through the university experience. And also explaining to the lecturer, having to explain to the lecturer deaf culture. And there was a lot of various roles that they would have to take on rather than just the simple one of interpreting the class. So there was more than the original role involved. And the lecturers saying from their perspective said the interpreters are more like a support worker. They saw them more as a support worker rather than a professional. And that was, a lot of people have mentioned that in my research. And the three different roles, the student, the interpreter, and the lecturer, the relationship between the three of them as a triad, really, it was rare to have that good relationship between the three of them. It was often the deaf student with the interpreter, or the interpreter with the lecturer. There was never really that kind of triad or that relationship between the three of them. It was always just between two of them at one stage. So to build up those relationships, you need to have trust, honesty, clarity. Everyone has to know exactly what their roles are, and there should be open communication. And that was the most common theme from my research on how to build up those relationships. One other thing as well is having a continuity of having a regular interpreter. And if you have that regular interpreter, you build up more trust and more awareness, and you feel that the lecturer can trust the interpreter, but at the same time, the student can also build their trust with the interpreter. There's more familiarity there, and that would help, to improve the overall relationship and overall experience. So I have a few more quotes. So this is for deaf student Sophie. And Sophie is talking about how to make sure you have a good relationship and work together well. So this can only happen if the interpreters and the lecturers can work together, and that the responsibility, kind of the burden, isn't left on the deaf students. So this is an interpreter, Ingrid. She felt that, in terms of managing expectations, she was having to advocate for the student, interpret for the student, maybe I'll sometimes note take for the student, and she was saying she didn't know, this is really part of my role. She's like, when I took on the job, I didn't think that all these extra things would be part of my role, but because she was working in an education setting, a lot of people would expect many different things from me, she said. So this is Liam. Liam is a lecturer, and Liam said that, he acknowledges that there are, additional responsibilities placed on disabled students, and the role is very, very different, but it shouldn't be. The lecturer's saying like they don't have enough experience with disabled students. They don't know how to, I guess, connect with them, and that's a big problem as well. Because Liam was talking about himself, and he's saying like, I should know better, I should know more, but I don't. And it's really up to the deaf students to educate the lecturer. So the third theme is the the classroom environment. So the most common thing here was, where the interpreter was placed or positioned in the room, whether it was a large lecture hall or whether it was a science lab. Is the interpreter going to be somewhere where you can't really see? Is the space limited? Is it going to be difficult? Is there going to be, a visual block in your eye line? And one thing that was mentioned quite frequently was that it was visual fatigue of having to look at the interpreter all the time is very tiring. A lot of interpreters mentioned how, classroom-based discussions, for example, if a student is sitting at the front of the room and everybody's behind them, there's a lot of conversation. The interpreter's trying to follow everything, and it's impossible to interpret everything to give full, the full conversation between all the different groups. And if there is group work done within a lecture, within a classroom, if there's one deaf student with three or four hearing students, sometimes the interpreter feels the responsibility, but they have to stop everybody and interrupt them all the time to kind of they feel like they need to almost like manage that the conversations happening there to make sure that they can get everything to interpret it. But most of the deaf people said they liked group work because they got to know the other hearing students, and it was quite positive. But one interesting thing was, if there was more than one deaf student, for example, if there were four deaf students and there was one interpreter, it means they can't go to different groups with different hearing people because there's not enough interpreters. So that was a problem as well. So it ended up in those situations where there was more than one deaf, they would have deaf student, they would have to work together, and they couldn't then split up and mix with other hearing students, which was an issue as well. And just to be clear here, my studies, my research, the six students that were involved, they were already a lot more aware about how to, mode shift or manage expectations and manage their time. But at the same time, the students and the interpreters, they repeated a lot that the lecturers didn't know, didn't have that much of experience of it. So they were talking about that. And so it's a different experience between the lecturers and the students and the interpreters. In terms of motivation, or having the confidence to put your hand up and ask questions, that there was a lot of that is linked with personal confidence. And so whether the student is quite young, whether they're the only deaf student and they don't have the confidence to kind of stand up in front of everybody, or whether there are other deaf students there or not, students, then they know that if there's a deaf group, they really support each other strongly. They're more than willing to speak up and ask questions and make comments, and compared to if they're the only deaf person in the room. And that's the interpreter's view as well. The interpreters agreed with that. So this is another quote related to this topic. This is Sabrina. So Sabrina had two different experiences. The first was going to study on her own, and the second was within a deaf group. So she's saying the first time she went to college, it was 4 years on her own, and she felt it was like hell. She was isolated, she wasn't motivated, she felt like she didn't want to learn. And so on her second university experience, she felt like it was fantastic. It was like from 0 to 100 straight away. It was a completely different experience, a completely different, a big change. And so this is Ivy, who's an interpreter who speaks about, talking about classroom discussions. If deaf students usually sit at the front, if they sit at the front, they're not able to kind of, I guess, you're still not able to interpret everything that happens in the classroom, even though you want to. And this is a lecturer called Lily. Lily was saying she was trying to think about how to, when she gives the classroom activities to do or work to do, she's trying to think of alternative things that she can do to suit the students, the ISL students. And so she found a few things that might have been good for classwork. So she gave it to all students. So they were able to use both types of work that she's given them. This is a good example of UDL, Universal Design for Learning. So the fourth theme is the intricacies of educational interpreting. So the first one we've talked about a lot is that there is a lack of ISL signs or vocabulary for, specific terminology, and interpreters often have to, create their own signs in agreement with the students. Maybe they'll meet the students before class to establish signs. They might have a list of vocabulary, and between them try to create new signs to use within the class. And that happens quite often. At the same time, if there's a really complex subject, whether it's abstract or like heavy on the theory, and an interpreter has to, interpret this into ISL, that happened quite a lot. And so the signs that are being used might be different each time. So, for example, one interpreter mentioned they would use two different signs for electricities. There's this one and this one. So electric or electricity. And the interpreter felt that they should agree one sign between all of the interpreters that work with this one specific student, because that would help the student process less. Because, if there was a database of different signs and vocabulary that they use, it would be helpful. Really, the interpreters use a variety of signs for the same student and for the same terms, and that's extra pressure on the students. They have to process a lot more. It's more on it's a heavier cognitive load. So the interpreters need to have access to the lecturer's materials, which is really important for preparation ahead of lectures. Interpreters and students and lecturers, I've tried to meet before class to discuss it, but the interpreter saying there was concern around confidentiality. For example, if there was one interpreter who was on their own with one deaf student, and they might work them Monday, Tuesday, and Friday, and there was a different interpreter who would work on Wednesday and Thursday with the same student. But the one interpreter didn't talk to the other interpreter, or they didn't share information about what had been agreed or what they discussed, because they were worried about confidentiality. So there were a lot of interpreters who had mentioned at the start they were worried about confidentiality because their code of ethics, they're not supposed to discuss, work that they've done. But then they realized after a while they should be a lot more open to communication with other interpreters who are working on the same classroom with the same student. There were a lot of really long hours, because especially in education, it's getting better now, obviously, but you would need to have two interpreters. But you still see in educational settings there will be one interpreter working on their own through the entire morning and maybe up to after lunch. And a lot of interpreters mentioned they are exhausted. It can affect their processing, it can affect their production of sign, and it can affect the student, because the student is looking at the interpreter and they're also tired. And if the student feels that the interpreter is not doing their best because they're tired, it can affect their studies as well.
So this quote is from Sinead, and Sinead says she talks about one lecturer giving her feedback about an assignment and said that she needed to use more specific terms more often. And then she realized that actually the interpreters had not been giving her one particular word. They didn't give her one of these words that she was told that she needed, but the lecturer thought that it was because, this deaf student doesn't know this particular word. So this became about a translation and an interpreting issue, the fact that sometimes these individual words aren't given. This is an interpreter's quote. Isla, she's talking to the fact that she's working alone, and she said, I think educational interpreting is one of the most difficult jobs because of the long hours, because of the effect that you can have on their education, and because interpreter quality can drop. And now we've a quote from a lecturer, Lucy, who's a lecturer in postgraduate studies, and Lucy said that it was quite useful because the interpreters, if they had some sort of a knowledge of the subject area before, that was really useful, and things could progress more quickly because they had that theoretical base. Okay, the final issue then was capacity building. And what I found was a lot of the students and lecturers weren't necessarily clear about the role of the interpreter and what exactly they were there for. And students didn't have enough information about how to work with an interpreter. This was a big issue. Interestingly enough, all 6 of the lecturers in the research said that they had learned so much from working with deaf students and interpreters, and they'd found it a hugely positive and beneficial experience. That was a really interesting comment. Now, going back to the interpreters and the deaf students, they noticed that interpreters often didn't have the confidence that you needed to interrupt, to clarify, to ask the meaning of terms, to manage those stakeholders, because it's often their first time as a new interpreter going into an interpreted setting and starting off their career in that space. And everyone said that educational interpreting is actually something that's more suited to experienced interpreters rather than newbies going in straight after graduation. So another quote for you. So Circa, who's a deaf student here, is talking about the need for more experience. And she says, one thing that really interpreters should do is go to different kinds of community events, work in different kinds of jobs. Then maybe you do your education, interpreting your legal, interpreting your medical. Get that experience first. Because if you have a limited vocabulary and then you go straight into a university setting, it's not going to be ideal. This is an interpreter, Isabel, and she's talking about how she has to explain her role to lecturers. And she says that quite often there's a patronizing attitude there that she has to correct. You have to kind of butter up the lecturers to get them to cooperate and, massage their egos a little bit. And that's very much the university sector she's talking about there. And then this is a lecturer, Laura, and she was a teacher of a co-enrolled group. And she said she loved teaching in that particular setting. She learned a huge amount, and also the hearing students in the class loved that experience too. So conclusions. So as I've mentioned at the very start, my 3 research questions. So how well have I answered those questions? Well, my research is quite lengthy. I really am cramming them into little single line answers here, but we talked about this triadic relationship, the clarity of roles, the trust, the collaboration, and the respect for each other that's needed between student, interpreter, and lecturer. The second question, we talked about the difference in teaching one deaf student versus a group, what the differences were, and the fact that it was noticed that teaching a group of deaf students meant that you had to recognize the different way you had to approach things as opposed to one deaf student, where you might be aware of the deaf student in your class, but do things essentially in a similar way compared to the amount that you'd have to remember. I suppose it's more reactive situation with one deaf student on their own. And then number 3, inclusion. You do need to be flexible, you need to be consistent, collaborative supports. You need to keep that relationship going, you need to keep it strong. And lecturers definitely felt that all these things were required. Also, my research did have some recommendations and different levels of recommendations, the macro level, the meso level, and micro level, all the way down. And, these are things that we could see in the future, hopefully. And again, this is a very, very brief summary of my recommendations. Number 1, to develop a structured preparation program for deaf students. So a training program, what it's like to transition into higher education. And we had something like that previously, but not for a while now. We do need peer advocacy as well and peer support workshops on this to give people the benefit of experience that other people have and to enable them to advocate for themselves. Secondly, we need more inclusive teaching practices and styles to include deaf students. And we're seeing more knowledge now about universal design and so on. But what's important is that lecturers, once they know that, also know how to apply that and work with interpreters. And it is a little bit different in terms of interpretation and ISL because it's a different language. And so that has lots of knock-on effects. And so here's an example here. My research would say that potentially like an online training program like this could be developed. Now, this is kind of a fake website for a training program like that I've just given you to give you an idea. Number 3, then, what's needed is some kind of a framework, something for interpreters, because interpreters did have a lot of concerns about being able to talk to other professional interpreters about a student that they both work with, and that led to a lot of soul searching. So specific training or a specific framework of some kind is needed because an interpreter just doesn't go in one day and leave the next. They are potentially working with a student for 4 years or even 7 years. So it's really important that interpreters have some kind of framework, that they know that they're able to share some kinds of information with their colleagues in different communication ways and so on, about vocabulary in a professional manner, interpreting related issues and so on. The 4th recommendation then, communication channels being formalized between all 3 stakeholders, because participants in the research said that students would often email the interpreters or lecturers would email the interpreters to set up some kind of an online learning. And it wasn't really clear what way the channel of communication was supposed to go. So agreement about that at the outset is really important. Look, let's communicate by email, or let's do this on Blackboard, or whatever learning management system is there, but some kind of agreement about how information is to be shared. Number 5, this is in relation to disability support services and the need for more communication with lecturers, and also to have a plan B. Let's say an interpreter isn't available. What other kind of supports can be put in there instead? There is a need to provide that kind of support as well. That was a big thing that came up in the research. Number 6, then, I suppose this is in relation to policy within universities and the need for more. I suppose, you might already have, a positive attitude to diversity in areas like that, an inclusive culture. But do social events on campus have an interpreter? Is that really embedded everywhere? Are ISL classes provided for hearing students? I mean, that's one of the big pieces of positive feedback that students gave, is working deaf and hearing together in the same group. And ISL classes for hearing students helped build those relationships. So you have to think about outside the classroom as well as inside. There is a need to be holistic. Number 7, more interpreting, more funding for interpreting and supports like that. And still, you will see situations where one interpreter is in place, not two, because of funding restrictions. And I suppose other interpreting jobs, maybe there's less of a budget required for that because you're talking about a new interpreter going in, and maybe the pay is lower, but at the same time, it still isn't low enough that 2 interpreters can be funded. And again, it doesn't consider the need for interpreters for evening events. You have to think outside the classroom. This is a big issue. More funding is required for that overall education experience. And number 8, then, there's already some glossaries in ISL for STEM and for other topics, but quite often they're not clearly communicated. And sometimes, you need more than just the STEM vocabulary. There's other areas of linguistics where we need development of the ISL lexicon as well. So we need more focus on that, for training that and embedding that into interpreters, and also as well making sure that deaf students know these terms and making sure that the vocabulary is known by all. And interpreters would have often, let's say, experience of regularly going to particular colleges, working with 2 interpreters, and also the need for more experienced interpreters if possible. If you have one interpreter with experience with a newer interpreter, this might be an ideal way to provide mentoring experiences for new interpreters, as well as providing cover for deaf students. Okay, so here's some areas for possible future research. I've talked a lot about deaf students, and I've mentioned that transition from school to higher education, and that's a really important journey that needs more attention and research. Sometimes as well, you'll find that this came across in my research kind of unexpectedly. Lots of issues come up about notes and note takers and other kinds of support services. And I think there's a need to do some research into those other supports and their provision as well. Educational interpreting, I suppose, in terms of processing of that, that needs more research too. There's very little in the Irish sector about that. Not a great in-depth Irish literature about the linguistics and the mental processing involved in educational interpreting, and also comparative studies, maybe deaf students compared to other students with disabilities in terms of feeling isolation on campus. I'd love a comparison between other groups. And then the impact of universal design, UDL, and policies. How are they working? Are they working well or not at all? What evidence is out there? And the very, very last point I'll make, I'm very aware of time here. I've mentioned earlier on in the presentation, all the names obviously are anonymized. They're not the real names of participants. I just wanted to emphasize that. You see all the lecturers' names begin with L, all the students' names begin with S, and all the interpreters' names begin with I. So none of the names are the names of the actual respondents or my interviewees. Okay, so I think that's everything. So I guess it's open now to questions. Thank you. Oh, sorry, just bear with me a second. Sorry. Wow, that's a really fascinating presentation, Caroline. And I suppose it brings me back to my own experiences, a while ago in an Irish university, and that feeling of isolation, the need for connection. so many of these points resonated with me, and it's quite sad to see that some things haven't developed and are changing, but some things are not and are still with us, unfortunately. I also think it's interesting as well getting the lecturer's perspective, and that's certainly a new dimension to things. I mean, and it's great to see three different views on this same area. So fantastic.